There's a convent in northern France where the floors are still made of the same stone laid in 1247, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. And if you walk those halls now, you can still see the shallow depressions where women knelt to pray at the same spots every morning for 800 years, their knees carving invisible grooves into rock that outlasted empires. Sister Catherine woke at 4 every morning, not because a bell rang, but because her body had learned the rhythm after 2 years, and she would dress in the dark, her fingers finding the hooks and ties of her habit without thought, the fabric heavy and coarse against skin that had stopped noticing the discomfort sometime during the first winter when everything hurt, and then eventually nothing did. The refectory smelled like boiled vegetables and old wood, and the women ate in silence because speech during meals was forbidden. But silence wasn't the absence of communication, it was its own language. And Sister Anne could tell from the way Sister Marie held her spoon whether she had slept poorly or whether her back hurt again from scrubbing floors. And none of this required words, because words were for the outside world, and this was somewhere else entirely. They washed dishes in water so cold it made their hands ache, and they dried them with cloths that had been washed and re-washed so many times the fabric had no color left, just a kind of gray that matched everything else, the walls, the sky through the narrow windows, their own skin in winter when the sun barely reached the courtyard. Sister Marguerite spent 6 hours a day in the garden pulling weeds, her hands permanently stained with dirt that no amount of scrubbing removed. And when visitors came, they would comment on how peaceful it must be to work with growing things, how contemplative, how holy, and she would smile because that was expected. But the truth was that pulling weeds was just pulling weeds, repetitive and mindless, and sometimes her knees hurt so badly she wanted to cry, except crying required privacy, and privacy didn't exist in a place where even your thoughts were supposed to belong to God. The confessor was a priest named Father Bernard who came twice a week and heard confessions in a small room that smelled like mildew. And the things the nuns confessed were so minor, so desperately insignificant, feeling resentment during prayer, having unkind thoughts about another sister, taking a second piece of bread when the first wasn't enough, and he would assign penances that were designed to hurt just enough to feel meaningful, kneeling on stone for an hour, standing with arms outstretched until muscles trembled, fasting when you were already hungry, and none of this was questioned, because questioning implied you knew better than the structure that held everything together. Sister Agnes disappeared in the spring of 1632, and no one announced her departure. There was no farewell, no explanation, just her absence at morning prayer, and someone else sleeping in her bed that night. And when the younger nuns asked where she had gone, the older ones would say something vague about God's plan or necessary transfer. And the conversation would end, not because the answer was satisfying, but because continuing to ask was inappropriate. The library where the nuns had been allowed to read for 1 hour each week was locked in autumn of that same year, and the key disappeared, and no one knew why or who had decided this, or whether it would be temporary. And eventually they stopped wondering, because wondering changed nothing. Letters from families were read by the abbess before being delivered, and sometimes they weren't delivered at all, and there was no way to know if this was because the family had stopped writing or because the abbess had decided the contents were spiritually dangerous, distracting, insufficiently supportive of the nun's vocation. Sister Helene's mother was dying, and her brother wrote to tell her this, and the letter sat in the abbess's desk for 3 weeks until after the mother had been buried, and when Helene finally received it, the funeral was already over, and there was nothing to do but pray for a soul that had already been commended to God, and the abbess explained that this timing had been merciful, that knowing earlier would only have caused suffering without purpose. The visiting rights that families had been granted once per quarter were reduced to once per year, then suspended indefinitely due to concerns about disease, about the corrupting influence of worldly conversation, about the need for the nuns to focus entirely on their spiritual development without the distraction of attachments that belonged to their previous lives. Sister Louise hadn't seen her sister in 4 years when she learned through a letter that had somehow bypassed the abbess's screening that her sister had married and had a child, and this news arrived like information from another planet, so distant and irrelevant to her current existence that she couldn't quite connect the woman with a baby to the girl she remembered, and she realized she had stopped being able to picture faces clearly, that memory required maintenance, and she had let hers decay. The convent's walls were high and topped with iron spikes that faced inward, which someone had explained was to keep intruders out, but the design suggested otherwise, and none of the nuns mentioned this, because mentioning it would require thinking about what it meant to need spikes facing the people inside rather than the people outside. Sister Therese, not the abbess but a different Therese, had a sister who was a nun at a different convent 60 miles away, and she had been promised they could exchange letters, but over time these letters became less frequent and then stopped entirely, and when she asked about this, she was told that correspondence between convents encouraged favoritism, created divisions, weakened the unity of the community. And the logic made sense in the way that things make sense when you've stopped having the energy to examine them closely. In November 1634, there were new rules, not introduced as changes, but discovered gradually through correction and punishment. And one of these rules was that nuns were not permitted to speak to each other outside of designated times, and the designated times were reduced from 3 hours daily to 30 minutes, and then to 15, and then the rule became that speech was permitted only when addressing the abbess or during confession, and silence filled every space like water rising slowly in a locked room. Sister Beatrice tried to maintain eye contact with the other nuns as a way of preserving some connection, some acknowledgement that they were still people who saw each other, but this was noticed and corrected, and she was assigned to work in the laundry room alone for 3 months as penance for creating inappropriate intimacy through nonverbal communication. They were weighed monthly, and their weights were recorded in a ledger, and if someone had gained weight, this was treated as evidence of gluttony, of taking more than their share, even though the portions were controlled and identical. And if someone had lost weight, this was treated as evidence of vanity, of refusing food to maintain a worldly concern with appearance. And there was no correct weight to be, only an ever-shifting target that ensured everyone was always failing in some measurable way. Sister Pauline's hands developed tremors from malnutrition, and when she spilled water during a meal, this was interpreted as carelessness rather than medical necessity, and her portions were reduced further as correction, and the tremors worsened, and the cycle continued until her body learned to function on whatever it was given, because the alternative to functioning was not being given anything at all. The abbess introduced examinations of conscience that happened publicly during chapter meetings, where each nun was required to confess her failures in front of the entire community, and these confessions followed a pattern, admissions of pride, of insufficient devotion, of thoughts that strayed from God, and the sameness of the confessions revealed that they weren't true confessions, but performances of a script everyone had learned, and performing the script was safer than saying anything real, because real confession would mean admitting things that couldn't be corrected through penance, systemic things, structural things, things that implicated the people listening. Sister Madeline was accused of particular friendship with Sister Anne. An accusation meant that they had been seen speaking together more than was appropriate, that they sought each other's company, that their relationship had warmth, and particular friendship was forbidden because it created loyalties that competed with loyalty to God and to the community, and the word used was particular, but the word meant was human, and they were separated, assigned to opposite ends of the convent, and forbidden from acknowledging each other when they passed in hallways, and they obeyed, because disobedience meant expulsion, and expulsion meant damnation, or at least that's what they had been taught to believe, and belief is hard to shake, even when you suspect it might be wrong. The inspections started in winter. Visits from bishops and church officials who walked through the convent with the abbess trailing behind them, explaining and justifying. And during these inspections, the nuns were required to stand in rows, while men in fine clothes examined them like livestock, commenting on their appearance, their posture, their apparent health and spiritual development. And no one asked the nuns questions, because their opinions weren't relevant to the assessment. One inspector in 1636 wrote a report that described the nuns as well-disciplined, but noted that several appeared too thin, too pale, insufficiently vital. And his concern wasn't for their well-being, but for the convent's reputation, because nuns who looked half-dead reflected poorly on the institution's management. Sister Françoise developed an infection in her leg from kneeling on stone floors that were cleaned with lye, and the infection spread because there was no medical care, just prayer and waiting. And when her fever spiked, the abbess allowed her to rest, but only after she had attempted to continue her duties and collapsed, because resting before collapse would have been weakness, and collapse was proof that rest was finally necessary. The infection left her with a limp she would carry the rest of her life, and that limp became another thing to correct, another imperfection that needed to be hidden or overcome through will. And she learned to walk in ways that minimized the limp, even though this caused other pain, because visible disability was a distraction from God's glory. They cut the nuns' hair uniformly short in a style that removed any possibility of vanity, but also any possibility of individuality. And when Sister Genevieve cried during the cutting, this was treated as evidence that she had been too attached to her appearance, too invested in worldly beauty. And she was made to sweep the hair from the floor and burn it while the other nuns watched, a lesson about detachment that felt more like humiliation, but humiliation was considered pedagogically valuable. The mirrors in the convent were removed, except for one small piece of polished metal in the abbess's chamber, and the stated reason was to prevent vanity, but the practical effect was that the nuns stopped knowing what they looked like, stopped recognizing themselves when they caught accidental reflections in water or glass, became strangers to their own faces. Food was reduced further under the reasoning that gluttony was rampant, that the body needed less than the mind insisted, that hunger was clarifying, and meals became increasingly sparse. Vegetables boiled until they were tasteless, bread that was often moldy, water that sometimes carried illness. And the nuns ate what they were given and thanked God for it, because thankfulness was mandatory and hunger was holy. Sister Antoinette stole a piece of bread from the kitchen, not a large piece, just enough to stop the cramping in her stomach that kept her awake at night. And she was caught and made to stand in the refectory during meals for a week, without eating while the others consumed their portions in front of her. And the message was clear, that the body's needs were not legitimate reasons for disobedience, that suffering was preferable to sin, that you could want something and be denied it, and that denial was righteous. The night they came for Sister Marie, there was no warning. Just the sound of footsteps in the corridor after matins, when everyone should have been sleeping. And when they took her from her cell, she didn't resist, because resistance was unthinkable. And the next morning her bed was empty, and her few possessions were gone. And no one spoke about it, because speaking about it would have required admitting that something was wrong. And admitting that something was wrong would have meant choosing between action and complicity. And action wasn't possible, so complicity it was. The other nuns learned that Marie had been sent to an asylum, not because she was insane, but because she had questioned too openly, had suggested that perhaps some of the rules were not divinely inspired, but humanly enforced. and questioning was a symptom of spiritual illness that required isolation and treatment until the questioning stopped. Sister Isabel was 23 when they took her to the punishment cell, a room barely large enough to lie down in, with no window and no light, and they left her there for 6 days on charges of disobedience that were never fully explained. And when they brought her out, she didn't speak for 2 weeks, not because she had been forbidden to speak, but because something inside her had broken in that darkness, and language no longer seemed to work the way it had before. The punishment wasn't designed to be rehabilitative. It was designed to be preventative, a demonstration for the others of what happened when you stepped outside the lines that no one had drawn but everyone could see. They brought in a new confessor after Father Bernard died, a younger priest who seemed uncomfortable with the confessions he was hearing, confessions of sins so minor they barely qualified as thoughts. And he tried to be gentle in his penances, to offer reassurance instead of punishment. But the abbess spoke to him privately, and after that conversation his penances became harsher, more aligned with what was expected, and whatever compassion he had brought with him was trained out of him in a matter of months, because the system was stronger than individual kindness, and the system needed severity to function. Sister Charlotte's family tried to visit despite the prohibition, showed up at the convent gates asking to see their daughter, and they were turned away by the abbess, who explained that their daughter had renounced worldly attachments, that she had given herself completely to God, that their presence would only disturb her spiritual progress. And they left believing this because they had been taught to respect religious authority. And Charlotte never knew they had come, never knew they had tried, and she spent the next decade believing her family had forgotten her, when the truth was they had been prevented from remembering her in any way that mattered. On a morning of March 1638, the nuns were assembled in the chapel without explanation, and they waited for hours in silence until a bishop arrived with several officials, and he read from a document that described the convent as a place of exceptional devotion, a model of religious discipline. And then he announced that 12 of the nuns, including Sister Agnes, who hadn't disappeared but had been kept in isolation, would be transferred to a new convent being established in the colonies, a place where their sacrifice would serve God's expansion into heathen lands. The 12 were chosen not based on volunteering, but based on criteria no one explained, and they were given 3 hours to prepare, which meant there was nothing to prepare because they owned nothing, and they were loaded into a cart that took them to a port where they were put on a ship with no information about where exactly they were going or what would be expected of them when they arrived. The voyage lasted 11 weeks, and during that time 3 of the nuns died from disease, their bodies committed to the ocean in ceremonies so brief they felt like disposal rather than burial, and the remaining 9 arrived in the settlement that was less a town than a collection of wooden structures surrounded by forest that felt hostile and endless. They were housed in a building with no furniture, no heat, no running water, and they were expected to establish routines of prayer and work as if the infrastructure for such routines existed. And when they struggled with this, they were told that their struggles revealed weakness of faith rather than impossibility of circumstance. The local indigenous population watched them with confusion, not hostility exactly, but incomprehension, because the concept of women locked away from life in service to an invisible God made no sense in a cosmology where the sacred was everywhere and demanded participation rather than withdrawal. And the nuns tried to explain their purpose through translators who didn't have words for concepts like contemplative life or renunciation, and eventually they stopped trying to explain and just existed in parallel to the community that surrounded them, neither integrated nor expelled, just tolerated. Sister Marie-Thérèse, one of the 9 who survived the voyage, wrote a letter back to France describing conditions that were barely survivable, asking for supplies, for help, for acknowledgement that what they were enduring was beyond what human bodies could sustain. And the letter took 4 months to arrive, and when it did, the abbess who received it read it during chapter meeting as an example of insufficient gratitude, of worldly attachment to comfort, of failure to embrace the suffering that brought souls closer to God. And no supplies were sent. 2 more nuns died that first winter, one from fever and one from what might have been despair, but was recorded as natural causes. And the remaining 7 learned to survive by adopting practices the Church would have considered pagan if it had known, accepting food from indigenous women, learning which plants could be eaten and which couldn't, participating in communal work that violated their vows of enclosure but kept them alive. And they stopped reporting these violations in letters because the letters were read by people who had never been cold enough to lose feeling in their extremities, never been hungry enough to consider bark edible, never been isolated enough to understand that rules made in stone buildings didn't translate to wooden shelters in forests that had never heard of Rome. By 1642, only 4 of the original 9 remained, and they no longer resembled the women who had left France. Their bodies had changed from malnutrition and labor, their skin darkened by sun exposure that would have scandalized the abbess, their hands rough and scarred from work that nuns weren't supposed to do. And when a new priest arrived to minister to the settlement, he looked at them with visible disappointment, as if their survival had required compromises that disqualified them from the sanctity they were supposed to represent. He conducted an inspection, asked questions about their adherence to the rule, about their prayer schedule, their fasting practices, their maintenance of silence and enclosure, and their answers revealed a life that bore little resemblance to convent protocol. And he wrote a report describing them as fallen, as having succumbed to the influences of the wilderness and the savages, language that erased the fact that their adaptations had been necessary for survival, and reframed survival itself as a kind of failure. He imposed new restrictions, attempted to reinstate the rules they had abandoned, and for a few weeks they tried to comply. But compliance meant less food, less warmth, less contact with the people who had helped them survive. And one by one they became sick, and the priest interpreted their sickness as God's judgment on their previous disobedience, rather than the inevitable result of deprivation. Sister Anne, the last of the 4 to die, spent her final days in a fever that made her delirious, and in her delirium she spoke in a mixture of French and the indigenous language she had learned, and the priest who attended her couldn't understand most of what she said, but he recorded that her last words were a prayer, which they might have been or might have been something else entirely, and there's no way to know, because translation requires understanding, and understanding requires caring about accuracy more than narrative, and the narrative needed her to die holy rather than human. The convent in France continued operating for another century, and the nuns who had been sent to the colonies were commemorated in the convent's records as martyrs, as saints who had given their lives for God's work, and paintings were commissioned showing them in peaceful repose, surrounded by grateful indigenous converts, images that bore no resemblance to what had actually happened, but that served the purpose of making the deaths meaningful within the structure that had caused them. The archives contain letters from families asking about daughters who had entered the convent and then disappeared from all contact, and the responses are variations of the same message, that the nuns had renounced worldly ties, that they were serving God in ways that required complete separation, that their families should take comfort in their sacrifice, and none of these responses mention the punishment cells, the forced transfers, the deaths from neglect that were recorded as deaths from natural causes, the women who tried to leave and were prevented, the ones who succeeded in leaving and were hunted down and brought back and never seen again. There are account books showing expenditures for the convent, and the numbers reveal that less money was spent on food for the nuns than on decorations for the chapel, that maintenance of the building took priority over medical care, that the value assigned to their bodies was lower than the value assigned to the symbols meant to represent their devotion, and no one questioned this allocation because the bodies were temporary, but the institution was eternal, or at least that was the operating assumption. The last nun from the original community died in 1723, and by then the convent had been reformed, the harsher practices had been softened, new rules emphasized care and community, and the current nuns looked back at the old records and felt a kind of distant horror at what their predecessors had endured. But that horror was contained within a narrative of progress, of the church learning and improving, and it didn't extend to questioning why the structure that had enabled such treatment had remained fundamentally unchanged, why the assumptions about women's bodies and women's agency and women's capacity to choose their own suffering were still embedded in the foundation. And maybe what's horrifying isn't just what happened in that convent, but how unremarkable it was. How many other convents operated under similar rules? How many women lived and died in conditions designed to erase them? And how that erasure was considered holy, was considered evidence of virtue rather than evidence of a system that required women's disappearance to function. And how even now, when we talk about these women, we talk about their devotion, their sacrifice, their choices, as if choosing to enter a place where choice would be systematically removed could ever be meaningfully described as choice. The building still stands, and tourists visit, and they take pictures of the chapel and the gardens, and they comment on how peaceful it must have been. And none of them see the punishment cell because it's been converted to storage. None of them know about the cemetery behind the walls, where graves are marked only with numbers because names were considered unnecessary. None of them ask about the women whose families never heard from them again. And the silence that was mandatory for the nuns has become the silence that protects the institution from having to account for what it did in God's name.
Some things persist not because they're remembered, but because they're carefully forgotten, and the forgetting is itself a kind of continuation.